Arc 5, Chapter 78. The Remaining Ripples in the Watergate City.
Ah, Subaru. Thank goodness we did not miss each other. I have returned
To the shelter after picking up Julius. They came across Reinhard, who had just gone back to the same shelter. Subaru gave a surprised response at his speedy work, and Reinhard, who had slightly raised his hand up as he walked towards them, suddenly broke into a frown.
wrong.
There's definitely something wrong. But it's difficult to...
Against the Bowel Hunter, all the way up to the battle against greed. However, that line of thinking, of attaining salvation by divine grace, was...
Do you know anything about
Said this whilst looking down at the little girl in the dress that snuggled by Subaru's side. Subaru, in silence, did not reply to Reinhard's words. He merely kept staring at the Sword Saint, praying that the answer he desired would be returned. To the fervor of that gaze, Reinhard looked at the other person standing next to Subaru, and slightly narrowed his eyes.
No. Judging from his aspect and appearance, I believe he is one of the valorous individuals of this battle, though.
Julius's cheeks stiffened at Reinhard's reply. The two of them were supposed to be close friends, companions from the Order of Royal Guards. With his name eaten, that connection of friendship also ended up being severed. From the side, was feeling dejected too. The Sword Saint, as the strongest in the kingdom, was the most skilled swordsman, having cut apart even the witch cult. Not even Reinhard von Astrea could escape the influence of the authority of gluttony. Or perhaps, to have thought that it was possible if it were Reinhard was only a baseless wish. That wish was cruelly broken, and only confirmed his own shallowness.
My apology, unable to meet your expectations.
Huh? It is us who should say that. From your point of view...
It was Julius himself that took responsibility in replying to Reinhard's apology. He masked the shock of being treated as a stranger by a friend. He looked around the shelter as he covered himself with words of calmness, and then...
It seems like it is almost time for the important people to have gathered. It is high time to start the conference that shall include future actions.
I understand. You mean to say that we shall talk about you too there, right?
The valorous individuals of the defensive battle from earlier, those involved in the royal selection, along with the city officials, were beginning to gather inside the shelter. And right then, a young woman dressed in a kimono came back from outside that very shelter.
It looks like they've gathered before we told them to. How convenient.
Anastasia, who had finished looking around the outside, said that with a smile as she tugged on her scarf, echidna. From within the surrounding shelter, in her field of view, she obviously must have seen the figure of Julius standing next to Subaru, but it did not look like she was going to mention him.
It seems like, with Amelia-san and y'all and Felt-san, we're nearly just about complete. If Priscilla-san comes after, then that'll be enough. Then, I reckon we can start the conference.
Anastasia made her suggestion out to her one knight, who should have been reflected in the corner of her eyes. It seemed that the shelter had not been used during the turmoil.
To start off with, it ought to be wanted to go back to the inn, but it seems like the cleaning still hasn't ended.
When it came to oil, Anastasia had probably made that comment so it could mean either one, so to take the initiative amongst those who had gathered at the meeting place.
First of all, let me thank you all for your help, including both the people here and those who aren't. I believe it was a battle like no other.
Silent faces became harder at Anastasia's words, who in some regards seemed unconcerned. At that, Anastasia shrugged her shoulders and looked around the room. At the meeting place, not only were the original members who had undertook the battle to defend the city assembled, but also the other collaborators, those who had gotten involved, had joined. From the Amelia camp, there was Amelia, Subaru, and Beatrice. Both Garfield and Otto were absent due to the gravity of their injuries. From the Felt camp, there were Felt, Reinhard, and Camberley, whose face was pale because of how out of place he felt. Gaston and Larkins were absent due to their wounds and exhaustion. From the Krusch camp, the most important member, Krusch, was still lying in bed, so Ferris and Wilhelm were participating instead of their mistress. From the Priscilla camp, there was Al and Sound. It looked like Heinkel's safety had been confirmed, but he was an absentee. And from the Anastasia camp, there was Anastasia, who was standing in the center like she had taken the reins. Tivy and Ricardo were both participating as well, the latter of which had white bandages wrapped throughout his body. And Julius, who was seated away from them, was on the Amelia camp side. Finally, Kiritaka and Liliana were in attendance, as well as the total, who were involved one way or another, had gathered in the room to carry out the post-war conference of the defensive battle. And the one who got the ball rolling and spoke out a rebuttal against Anastasia's initial speech was Ferris, his attitude unsettled. His yellow eyes shook with irritation as he raised his hand up.
The post-conference is important. I understand that, but I wish to speak about how we're going to deal with the Synarch Bishop. In the end, one of the top brass of the witch cult was captured alive, right? There are many things that we need to ask. I want to hurry that up.
Well, I knew Farah-san was gonna say that. By the way, what's Crush?
She's stable. We couldn't get any information of Lust, so right now she's recovering her strength with my healing magic, and relying on her willpower. For a moment, her symptoms were relieved a bit thanks to Subaru-kun's help, but...
Being looked at out of the corner of the eye by the frustrated Ferris, Subaru exposed an unseemliness like that of a burn or birthmark. A similar change had occurred in Subaru's right thigh, which was covered by his trousers. Subaru did not feel any pain or the feeling of anything foreign in it, but it was not like that for Krush. There's black veins on her skin. That a beautiful woman like Krush had been affected made it stand out.
Live. That thing's a being that brings only trouble. If it's possible, killing them in a hurry would definitely be for the best.
But then our leads would disappear!
While Subaru worried about the black veins, the argument between Anastasia and Ferris was reaching a boiling point. In regards to Anastasia, who had suggested execution, it was natural from his point of view.
And to crush Hassan's is a pity, but they're different matters. Besides, that Wrath even knows anything about Lust. No, I don't think they do in the long run. To me, it seems very unlikely that the witch cult was cooperating with each other.
If they're connected, then why? Why did something like today happen?
Of course, even I ain't saying that their actions overlap by happenstance. But their aims. Retreat times and dispersion don't match. It'd be a little weird to call that cooperation.
Anastasia as well had realized that her suggestion was difficult to accept, and it did not seem like she was going to give a rebuttal to that, which had been denied by Ferris's sentimental arguments. Thereupon, Subaru slowly raised his hand up.
May I say something? It's pointless getting information out of Wrath.
What do you mean?
Isn't it a story I'm proud of? But a little while ago, I was allowed to speak with Wrath for a short amount of time. There I was able to hear a little bit about Gluttony. We can't get any information out of them.
In fact, Wrath had thrown some words similar to a warning at Subaru about Gluttony. Thanks to that, there was a part in which Subaru had realized the possibility of Gluttony having several individuals, and had ended up not overlooking Julius when he had tried to distance himself from the shelter. He could not close his eyes to this. Nevertheless, within Subaru's true feelings, he also had a part which agreed.
I also have a bad feeling in regards to keeping them captured. Though, all the Sin Archbishops are like that.
Right now, so that they could partake in the conference, Sirius's guard duty had changed without quarter, and had even been gagged so as to stop her from talking. They had also been instructed to take turns keeping guard, as their hearts had the potential to be manipulated were they unending.
It's necessary to feel this anxiety whilst they are captured alive. I can't unconditionally make a decision about what to do about that.
Which side are you on?
Ferris pointed his eyes, which were full of hatred, towards the fence-sitting Subaru. Subaru grimaced at the heat of his gaze, and said,
I'm not taking sides. Honestly, I think both of you are right, which haven't turned black. If that solves the issue, then I think there'll be no issue.
Ha.
Subaru?
Subaru's own judgment was a fairly extreme conclusion for the topic of Krush's black veins. Upon hearing those words, Ferris's face became flabbergasted, and Amelia looked at him, her eyes rebuking him. Everyone else also turned to look at him with shock and complex emotions in their gazes.
I also heard about that, but that's truly as a last resort, right? We don't know what will happen in the future, even if it's nothing right now, but acting like this is normal is...
Well, it's not like I even want to put that seemingly unhealthy ink in my body for fun. But we have a precedent with Krush-san that it relieved her symptoms a little. What I mean to say is, don't hurry in drawing conclusions.
Involve his, nor any of the others' lives. He would try and help as much as he could, if it was up to something like darkening his out-of-sight skin.
Ferris, sit yourself for the time being. Subaru Dono is right.
I know. I really know.
The one who pulled Ferris's sleeve, who was lost for words, and made him calm down, was Wilhelm. Ferris looked down and attempted to say something to Subaru, but sat down without saying anything in the end. Subaru let out a sigh on seeing his state. The mood around continued.
In any case, I understand that everyone's opinions regarding the treatment of the Sin Archbishops are divided. It's worrying to keep them alive, and even the limits of mine and Natsuki-kun's instincts ain't cover.
What? Has this worthless spiel ended? No matter how much you gaze upon no reward shall be given to a show that lacks value. Cease that beggar's look immediately.
Priscilla replied with a yawn to the bantering Anastasia's look. That misplaced reply was proof that Priscilla had not been listening to the conversation properly up until now. Her participating in this conference must also have been some kind of whim of hers.
Don't speak so slyly. Though, that attitude is unbecoming for one who captured someone from the witch cult alive. But, out of all people, why did you capture him? What led to this bizarre turn of events?
As if I knew whether she would live or die. As the final blow was dealt, the Yang sword clouded over, and its sharpness disappeared. Thus, she survived. The one who dragged her out from the canal was one of the rabble, who had drained the water in search for the songstress. It has nothing to do with me.
It doesn't bother you that the one you'd tried to kill didn't die?
On the contrary, I drove the sword solely to kill. If she did not perish by that, then I have no intention to kill her again. Though she did not expire by my hand,
who, as ever, had elaborated her enigmatic theory. Subaru did not know her intentions either, but Priscilla's thinking probably was not understood by anyone else. It was dubious whether even Al and Schult, who stood by her side, were able to make...
I do want to respect Ferris's feelings, of course, but it also poses a unique opportunity for the kingdom. On top of strictly keeping guard of them, I think we should make an effort to get what they know out of them.
I think it's better to kill them. Even just remembering those Sin Archbishops makes me sick to my stomach. And I don't think they'd say anything that half makes sense. It's better to kill them before being dragged into something problematic, so they won't cause any problems in the future. Probably.
Felt-sama.
For your information, I ain't saying this to get on your nerves this time. At all.
Reinhard, who had advocated that they should keep Wrath alive, and Felt, who had denied custody to the kingdom.
I shall be the one responsible for escorting Wrath to the royal capital. In the case Wrath is scheming something, I would be the person most able to deal with it. And in the worst case, there is the eventuality that a conviction might need to be carried out too.
When it comes to being suitable for that, you're it, apparently. But in this case, will Felt-san follow you to the royal capital too? Or shall master and servant go their separate ways?
If Reinhard's going, I'm going too. This time it can't be helped.
A fleeting glimpse of his face from the side, and plastered a deep scowl on her lovely face.
Don't get the wrong idea. The fact that I can't stand you ain't changed. It ain't changed, but there's times when I ain't gonna do that.
There are times when you aren't going to do that.
I don't know. Try asking that to your own chest. My chest ain't soft enough to reply back to you.
Sticking out her underdeveloped chest for her age, Felt stuck her tongue out at Reinhard. Reinhard cast his eyes down, seeing his master's attitude, and then quietly lifted his chin up. Only they themselves knew what feelings there were between master and servant. At any rate, it looked like the Felt camp too was not the same as it had been a year ago.
Well, in that case, I'll...
Camberley, look after Larkins and Gaston. Once they can move about, they may first return back to the mansion. Bring them only in contact with Ramji.
Yes, sir. I understand.
A look of relief came over the uncomfortable-looking Camberley on receiving his orders. For now, thanks to Reinhard volunteering, they could feel at ease regarding Wrath's escort. What came after, that which they could get out of Sirius, would be the duties of the kingdom's experts.
Then, may we move on to the next issue? Ladies and gentlemen?
The one who had raised his hand up after seeing the matter of Wrath's treatment decided upon had been Kiritaka. He gazed at everyone's faces while he adjusted his slightly messy hair with his hand, and then he spoke out.
First of all, regarding the battle to protect this city, I would like to thank you all, on behalf of all citizens. If it were not for all of you, the city of Prestella would likely have fallen into the evil clutches of the witches' cult. I offer my deepest gratitude for that.
Kiritaka hung his head low and bowed, having taken responsibility for speaking of the general consensus of the city. Liliana, who was by his side, with a look of panic on her face, also bowed her head like Kiritaka had. Putting Kiritaka aside, Liliana's earnest reaction was quite unlike her. Perhaps her fight against Wrath, or something after that caused a change in her attitude. In any case...
We were already in the city and involved. We didn't have the option to just watch on as a spectator. So, you don't have to thank us to this grandiose extent. Don't you think?
Yeah. Besides, maybe the witch cult taking over the city was just a bonus for them, judging by their aims. Whether we saved them or they saved us, maybe we don't know which one it is.
Emilia and Subaru insisted that it was hard for them to accept the praises at face value for the witch cult's attack. Certainly, the greatest part of repelling the witch cult had been down to the merit of the members gathered here. However, in the first place, the Sin Archbishop's aims were Emilia, the artificial spirits, and the Book of Wisdom. All those things had been brought in by those involved from the outside, and the Emilia camp had been responsible for gathering them all. They could not accept their praises with full sincerity.
Wait up! It bothers me that you still would have slammed the door shut on those witch cult guys. I reckon we need to talk more clearly about that.
'Tis vexing, but I am in agreement with that beggar girl. Do not drag us into all of you commoners' self-convenient diffidence. Do not be so conceited, you half-devil and you Philistine.
However, the harsh duo stated their rigid opinions upon hearing the words of Subaru and Emilia. Felt and Priscilla looked at each other after they finished speaking, and immediately looked away, their faces looking disgusted. Ever since, from the start, those two did not get along with each other. Only those in her camp were close.
By Emilia-sama's words, but as Priscilla-sama and Felt-sama said, the city's defense was all of your merit. This I vow as a representative of the city. In the meantime, I would like you to lend your strength.
Earlier?
Indeed, regarding the inhabitants who were transformed by that wicked power.
Everyone there was something which everyone here understood. The staff of the city hall, who had fallen into the evil clutches of lust, having been transformed into inhuman forms. One had been trained. They still were completely unable to do anything about the effect of the authority of lust, variation, and change. For now, they ought to have gathered them in one place and concealed
to catch lust in the first place. It is doubtful whether or not they would have any intention to restore them to normal.
Isn't it even impossible for Ferris?
The changes to the people who could not turn back to their original form were fundamentally different from injuries or disease. Seeing Subaru's gaze, Ferris shook his head and then bit his lips.
Even I simply can't cure that. No, it isn't about whether I can cure them or not. It isn't an injury or disease. They were just transformed into those kind of creatures. Healing magic can only...
If they have awareness.
If they clearly understand their circumstances, they'd end up going crazy, I guess.
They had lost their own figures. It was a frightening change, even just thinking about that. However, considering that they had been changed into something inhuman, into something repulsive, it made it all the more worse. With one's body not being freed, even losing the means to express one's own will, it was pretty easy to imagine what they would be.
Insects would want to die, I would imagine. If there is no chance to turn them back, absurdity is also a kindness. In short, that is all it means.
With her harsh view, Priscilla dismissed Al, who had instinctively voiced his opinion. However, the reason why Al did not make any more objections was because Priscilla's opinion was also correct in some sense. Of course, he did not believe they should die, but they had been transformed into flies, and there was no known way to get them back to normal.
I wished to ask everyone about that. It does not matter, even if it is a shot in the dark. Does no one have any idea how to cure them?
Still seemingly clinging onto hope, Kiritaka's question was drenched in both expectation and resignation. No, the amount of resignation was stronger, and that was natural. If there had been any possibility to cling on to, someone would have been bound to have suggested it by now. In other words, at this point in time, without any allusions to a solution having been made so far.
I understand. I profusely apologize for the inconvenience. Dealing with them is an issue for the city. We will take the responsibility afterwards.
Take the responsibility? What will you all do?
We will consider the possibilities after this. We have to check the will of those involved and see each of their conclusions. No matter what the final opinions are, we shall see it through to the very end.
They sounded like strong words that implied an end in which their life was inevitable in a sense. It was inevitable, but it was too soon for that.
In their transformed bodies.
Yeah, I know. That's why I will make time to a way of putting them to sleep.
I see! Kashi!
Realizing Amelia's true intentions, Subaru snapped his fingers and then raised his voice. As he felt the people around him tilting their heads quizzically due to the unfamiliar words, Subaru nodded at Amelia, who was looking at him.
In other words, you mean the same way as with the brides in the church, right? With Amelia Tun's magic, we'll put the transformed people into a state of suspended animation. It may just end up postponing the inevitable, but it's sufficient to be able to put off making a conclusion. In the meanwhile, we should find a solution.
Not end up freezing to death in their sleep.
They'll be fine. It was a short while, but I used this on the brides, so I understand the effects on one's health. And besides, I also slept for around 100 years by myself.
You yourself slept?
Although an undesired commotion spread throughout the meeting place, Subaru clenched his magic, and that she had insisted on trying to use it this way as well. That, and it was a fine play that even Subaru had not thought about. It certainly was no drastic solution to the problem, but they just needed time to find a solution from somewhere other than lust, using the power of that witch factor. He had just taken in the witch factor of greed, and it was possible that reproducing the Sin Archbishop's authority was merely a pipe.
Let me do it. You won't regret it, for sure.
Amelia repeated her request to Kiritaka, who was hesitating, at a loss for what to think. Kiritaka agonized about it before her
Worried about Kiritaka-san? Why not? Let her try! After all, that Amelia-sama said, it's natural there's a chance of success!
Of course, I want to believe that too. Very much so, Liliana. However, this is something that involves many lives.
Amelia-sama will not fail! Because the Greek tells where they're summoned, any wall standing in their way, no matter how tall or thick it is. Blood boiling and flesh raising, a tale which fascinates everyone.
Place resounded throughout. None of Liliana's idealistic notions had any basis, but for some reason, they did have a strange persuasive power to them. Of course, it was not so simple as to make their conclusion using just that.
At the least, let's ask their families. If the staff of the city hall are the victims, then their families should be in the same city, right?
I was speechless in seeing the gaze in Amelia's eyes, and in hearing her assertion, and the one so far. Finally, Kiritaka let out a deep sigh.
Rather than jumping to hasty conclusions, since otherwise the battle to protect Bristella too had seemed reckless at first.
Yeah, I'm really thankful.
It is me who should be thanking you.
Kiritaka smiled wryly at having lost his position. After the conference, and after they got permission from the victims' families, it seemed like the giving her a thumbs up. Having cleared up the second point of dispute, what came next was their last topic on the agenda, and that was...
So, the last issue. There have been many reports of unconscious people of unknown identity that were found one after the other.
Likely, for the knight who had been forgotten and had remained silent until now, it was the most important issue.
Right now, the number of nameless people is reported of the White Dragon. Furthermore, it's very likely that the number of nameless people will increase in the future.
The one who led the debate and gave the report was Dynas. Most likely, that was the crest that denoted that they were scales of the White Dragon. The ambiguous testimony that he had given, who appeared to have been part of, must have been related to that crest as well.
It's okay to say that the guys who were attacked by the Sin Archbishops are nameless, right? Like the guys who popped up out of nowhere all of a sudden? Defeated.
Taking into account the situation, it's reasonable to think that, I'd say. Their uniforms have matching embroidery, so...
There are 36 people in a similar position. It's a complete mess. It's...
The victims of gluttony, dealing with the people who had had their names eaten, in some sense, were harder to deal with than the victims of lust. After all, the victims had completely not conscious, then there were no clues left to find their identity. Even with the people from the scales of the White Dragon, while it was great that their affiliation was known, but no one knew more than that. They did not know who they were caring for, or such.
All of the nameless... No, guys, prognosis on that?
It's the same as with lust as well. I don't know why they're unconscious. The result of my prognosis is that I think they're just getting weaker and weaker, but then there's that case of Rem-chan.
To the words of Felt, Ferris looked over at Subaru and then spoke. A year ago, having suffered the same damage from gluttony, Rem had been given a diagnosis similar to the nameless people. Still up until now, Rem had not woken up, and yet her health had not deteriorated. Even though she seemed asleep, it should be said that her body was not carrying out its functions for life support. Her hair was not growing, and there was not even any excretion. She was in an unfathomable state.
Putting aside knowing their identities or not, the care of those people is easy. It's better to deal with bedridden people since they're bedridden. We can just leave them sleeping in their beds. Even though, in truth, I'd like for someone who knows them to be by their side.
Since that ain't possible, that's the issue, ain't it? It's something arduous.
Even though we knew Sei had no other choice but to defeat gluttony for Rem. Even if he knew that, having offered was denied by Ricardo, who had raised his voice, his face showing no traces of ill will. Attitude still seemed unchanged, but there was something that was different in just one place, and that was the hefty mass of bandages wrapped around him, and his right arm missing from the elbow down.
Don't make such a miserable face, bruh. It's true that I screwed up, but I'm alive. When you think about what happened now, it's by far the most preferable damage.
Noticing Subaru's gaze, Ricardo raised his severed right arm up and bared his fangs. It seemed like Ricardo had lost his right arm due to an attack from gluttony during the fierce battle of the control tower. He had heard that from Julius, who had been fighting at his side. Julius had also told him that Ricardo had lost his arm protecting him, and that Ricardo himself did not remember it. As if proving that, Ricardo shifted his gaze to Subaru's side and said,
"Looks like you met the guy you were searching for. That's a relief, ain't it? Truly thank you for helping me earlier."
Calling Julius a handsome guy, Ricardo acted as if he was talking to a stranger. From the flow of the conversation, it seemed that Julius had exchanged with Ricardo the same words as back when he had tried to smokescreen Subaru at first. Julius should have carried the injured Ricardo to the shelter, so it could be presumed that Ricardo's thanks in the end were for that. Nevertheless, leaving this misunderstanding as is was far too agonizing. Besides, they had arrived at the topic of gluttony. It was time to cut to the chase, it seemed.
I have something which I want to talk to everyone about. It's something important that's related to the dealing of the Nameless.
Standing up, Subaru got the attention of everyone in the hall to himself. Right now, the one who had the most information on how to deal with the Nameless was Subaru. He felt everyone's gazes naturally filled with anticipation of a solution.
Anticipation. In all honesty, this isn't something which will yield hope immediately, but I have to
What are you planning to say?
Anastasia threw in a few joking words to Subaru, so to try most prepared for this. Otherwise, the fact had the potential to turn her current state of mind inside out from the roots. Subaru took a quick breath and then looked at everyone's faces. And finally, he looked at Julius, who nodded despite looking tense. Seeing that, Subaru then pointed to the neighboring Julius with his hand and asked his question.
Is there anyone who knows the name of this man here?
Silence prevailed in the meeting place. Lack of understanding, though. It was because everyone sensed the intent of Subaru's question, and word, it meant that there was no one with any idea about Julius's identity.
Ow! What about you? Don't you remember his face?
Oh, what's up, bro? Why are you nominating me all of a sudden?
Having had his name abruptly called out, Al raised his voice in sheer surprise. That behavior was enough to prove that he had memories of Julius inside of him, but even so, he had to make sure. Subaru placed his hand on the round table and posed his question to Al, whilst leaning forward towards him.
Do you really not know why? It's what you and I have in common. So do you not remember this guy? Well, reply to me!
Ah, so that's why. Sorry, bro, I know what you mean, but I don't think I can help you. That guy's nowhere to be found in my head.
Are you completely sure? If you think a little more seriously...
That's enough. That's plenty enough, Subaru.
As someone summoned from another world, Al presumed the intention behind those series of questions based off of that, but he had not nodded his head. Nonetheless, it was Julius himself who stopped the unrelenting Subaru. Julius clapped Subaru's shoulder with a forlorn smile on his face and bowed to Al.
I overexpected. I apologize. We apologize for our impoliteness.
You have no reason to apologize. Well, I don't know if there was such a reason to or not, but you don't need to apologize to me.
Waving his sole arm, Al turned his gaze away from Julius. There were no signs of falsehood in his reaction. It was probably true that Al did not remember Julius. Then that had nothing to do with the effect of the authority of gluttony. In that case, then, after all, the most likely reason was the witch factor inside Subaru's body, and it seemed to be...
Judging from the story, Subaru-dono, this young man was involved with us in position.
Wilhelm spoke out towards Subaru, sharing his deduction after observing the trio's exchange. Others would have most likely come to the same conclusion which the wizened swordsman did. Subaru nodded at Wilhelm, and then he turned to look towards Julius.
This is Julius. Julius Jaculius. Like all of you guessed, his name was eaten by gluttony, and ended up as one of the nameless people. But the process is different than the others who are unconscious. His consciousness remains.
We have such a case? He's forgotten by those around him, but he himself remembers. So, is this person one of ours?
With disbelief on his face, Ferris swept his gaze from Subaru to Julius, and then back again many times over. To the shivering Ferris's words, Reinhard tucked his chin in and said,
"It seems so."
The sword saint gazed at Julius with his tranquil eyes, and said,
"Before the conference, Subaru asked me the same question as well. He, Julius, was likely an acquaintance of mine or Ferris. Or maybe the word acquaintance is insufficient to describe our relationship. A friend, perhaps."
At the least, I thought of both of you as friends. If you both consider me a friend in the same way, nothing would make me feel more honored.
Friends? Then, Julius, you're a knight as well? One of the Royal Guard?
Both Reinhard and Ferris were bewildered at having been called a friend by a stranger. Their reaction could not be avoided, thus Julius corrected them, half in resignation. Subaru's insides were burning in anger as he watched the trio's exchange. What a warped, nauseating scene it was. Subaru was not privy to the details of how the three of them had met, how they ended up becoming friends, and what their friendship was like. Even so, as colleagues, as friends, the three of them should have interacted with each other in a close, naturally familiar manner. Now there was nary a trace left of those certain bonds. When Rem's name had been eaten, and everyone had forgotten her existence, Subaru had thought there was nothing that existed in this world that was more sorrowful than that. But what about Julius's current condition? The sensation of complete loss that invaded him from being abandoned by everyone in the world. If that were not sad, then what was? Sadness was not something you could compare, but even if it was, this was far too cruel.
I guess it ain't something like him being a plain old Royal Guard.
Out of the blue, Anastasia's words butted in between the painful first meeting of those friends. She put a thoughtful expression across her gentle features and licked her lips as she touched her jaw. Then, she pointed at Ricardo before then pointing at Julius.
Julius was the one who brought back, on his shoulders, the grievously injured Ricardo. Straight after, we talked a bit about Ricardo's treatment. He immediately left saying that he had to go and search for someone. I guess that's why you reacted the way you did, right?
Anastasia-sama.
It was their first encounter, which, between master and servant, one that should not normally occur. Recalling the bitter memories of that time, Julius spoke out the name of his master with anguish on his face. However, Anastasia did not even take notice of the presence of the quivering devotion that had been put into those words. She thought for a moment, and then raised one of her fingers.
Julius's son's nameless case is a rather unusual one. We don't know how many people in the city are in the same state, but mayhaps there's a possibility that other people are like the unconscious nameless, still to be identified. There's no doubt that this too is a serious situation. Ain't that right?
Moving her gaze away from Julius, Anastasia directed the theme to the outline of the debate. It looked like the matter of Julius's identity had been postponed as one of the problems that could not be resolved. That was pretty unjust treatment for the current Julius, but Subaru was the only one in this place who could feel outraged by it.
In light of these problems, I have a proposal, though. Is that okay?
A proposal?
Subaru's innermost feelings were put aside, and the attention of the conference was once again directed at Anastasia. Being the center of attention, Anastasia looked around the surroundings before finally settling her gaze on Subaru and Julius.
The victims of the witch cult, the victims of lust, is hopeless. Are we in agreement with that?
It would be difficult to force them to speak, in that way, result in clouding our view.
That doesn't mean I'm thinking about the worst either. But there ain't just one way to get an answer. I just wanted to say that.
There's a different way to get an answer.
Subaru, a different solution to asking the corresponding Sin Archbishops, who were the culprits behind the damage. If such a way existed, it would probably be close to a witch's deal. For a split second, a choice which Subaru must not make crossed his mind, in that, if it truly were the Witch of Greed, she would perhaps know the answer.
So, what do you mean? Please, tell us clearly.
However, Emilia asked Anastasia that idea, and then, while strumming her head with her fingers, Anastasia said,
If we can't get the information out of those crooked Sin Archbishops, then we ought to ask it to another person who may know.
However, unlike everyone else around him, who had realized what she was on about, Subaru had no idea what her statement meant.
I don't understand. Don't put on airs and say it clearly.
Felt sulkily demanded that from Anastasia, her understanding the same as Subaru's. Anastasia gave a wry smile to Felt's words.
The Sage Shala.
Huh?
The Pleiades Watchtower. If it's a sage who should be there, if they're the person of legends, sees everything in the world, it wouldn't be strange if they knew, right?
She said that, and revealed the true intentions behind her proposal.